We are going to be looking at different sampling methods, and in 6.1 specifically, we're going to be looking at bad examples. Okay, so the following examples will result in biased outcomes, and what that means is when a sample systematically favors certain outcomes. And we've talked about this a little bit before. The way that you word a question can be biased, and things like that. But what this is going to focus on is how these this is really an observational study, how these observational studies are set up. And so your first type of sample is called a voluntary response sample, where people participating are not required to respond. So a good example of this would be if you're listening to a radio show and they ask for people to call in on a certain issue, you're only going to get a response from your most passionate people on both sides of the issue. You're likely not going to get a response from somebody that maybe isn't quite as passionate. Or another example is, in our school, you receive a fair amount of surveys about different things, just trying to get a feel for, the opinion of the students in the school. But nobody is there to require it. And not that that's necessarily realistic for somebody to sit over your shoulder and say, you must do this. But technically that will result in some bias because once again, you're likely only going to take that survey if you're really passionate. Now, this doesn't group everybody, of course. There's going to be the students that just say, well, I don't feel passionate about this, but I'm expected to do it, so I'm going to do it. But for the most part, only students that feel really passionate about it are going to take those surveys that are being sent out. Okay, so again, anytime your response is not required, that's a voluntary response sample. And the reason why that could lead to bias is because only the most passionate people will reach out. The next type is called convenience sampling, where you sample only people that are around you. So a good example here is if you want to take a sample regarding something about the city of Mound, but you only sample the people in your neighborhood, that would be considered an example of a convenience sample. Again, you are only sampling people that were conveniently around you. And in this particular example of the people in your neighborhood, we have different socioeconomic statuses in Mound and surrounding area. And so by only surveying the people in your neighborhood, you're leaving out a whole demographic of other people, multiple demographics. And so, again, that's why that could cause some bias. Another example, just going back into a school, if you wanted to take a survey on something and you only asked the people in your first hour class, again, that you only asked them because they were in your class in first hour. And so, again, that was convenient to you. But that, once again, that's going to create some bias because you're not getting the views of other students. And then this doesn't have a name, but any sample that allows you to vote multiple times cannot be trusted. As an example, a lot of the all-star voting for professional sports leagues, they usually put a limit on it, but you can vote up to 20 times or 25 times or whatever it is. And again, kind of like for your voluntary response sample, only the most passionate people are going to vote as many times as they can. A person that maybe might not be as passionate is only going to vote once or twice. And so what you're doing there is you're providing a stronger voice for certain people. And that's kind of a good way to summarize what could lead to a biased sample, is when you are providing a stronger voice to a certain person or a certain group of people than others. In a unbiased sample, everybody's voice should be heard and everybody's voice should be considered at the same magnitude of everyone else's. Okay. Again, sometimes it's out of your control, in terms of like the surveys that Mr. McAmoyle sends out. Sometimes he can't sit there and make sure that you take it. And so, although that might result in some bias, that's kind of out of his control. Okay. So this isn't necessarily your fault, although what we're going to learn in chapter 6 is ways to avoid that as best we can. So let's look at a couple examples. It says a company distributes thousands of crates of oranges each week. Your job is to examine a sample of the oranges from each crate by selecting 10 from the top of each crate. It says, what type of sample is this? Well, I focus on this last part. It says you're selecting 10 from the top of each crate. Okay? This would be an example of a convenience sample. In terms of this scenario, the oranges on the bottom of the crate are probably the ones that actually need to be examined more than the ones on the top, because they just had a whole crate of oranges dumped on top of them, right? And so by only picking from the top, you're getting a very limited view of what that entire crate looks like. And so this is a convenient sample. Yes, it is biased. And you can kind of use your own words here, but again, you're getting a limited view of the crate of oranges in this case. And in this particular, you're also, again, probably choosing from the ones that are the best as it is, because again, they're on the top of the pile. Okay? But this would be an example of a convenience sample, because you're just choosing the ones that are the easiest to pick from. Let's get another example. Okay, it says a recent online poll posed the question: should female athletes and male athletes receive similar salaries? In all, 13,147, which was 44%, said yes, and 15,182, which was 50%, said no. The remaining 8% answered, I don't know. Okay, and the first question is, what is the sample size? Remember, sample size is the total number of people interviewed. Now you have to do some critical thinking here, because it doesn't tell you directly, but it does tell you that 50% was 15,182. And so if that was exactly 15%, I can multiply that number by 2 and know that my sample size was 30,364 people. Right? It goes on to ask about the margin of error for this sample. So again, reviewing some of the topics that we learned previously in our class here, margin of error is 1 divided by plus or minus the square root of n, where n is your sample size, which we just found out in the first part of the question. And so, forgot my plus or minus, there we go, of 30,364. Let's double check that on the calculator. Don't forget to multiply that by 100 to make it 8%. Now think about it here. This is actually, depending on what the population is, this is a pretty good size sample, 30,000 people. And so if I round to the nearest hundredth of a percent, your sample size is actually going to be pretty small. It's about 0.57%. Okay? And again, it's that small because we interviewed that number of people. I shouldn't say we interviewed, but that's how many people responded. Okay? What type of sample is this? Again, if I go back, it says a recent online poll. Okay? And so this would be an example of a voluntary response sample. And voluntary, that's not how you spell response, whoops. Voluntary response. And voluntary response samples are biased because only the most, well, not only, but the most passionate people are more likely to respond. Okay? And so that is why, in this case, you'd have to take these results with a grain of salt, right? Again, sometimes it's out of our control, but we also can't ignore the fact that there is some inherited bias in this. Okay? So that's kind of a quickie for 6.1. Again, just identifying bad types of samples, because moving forward, we're going to be looking at how to create a sample that is as fair as possible. Okay, so go ahead and work through Learning Target 6.1 and have a good rest of your day.